Welcome to tonight's Geostrategy in the Grassroots panel discussion entitled Geostrategic Challenges Facing the U.S. and Japan 2021 Plus. This discussion is made possible through a grant we received from the Sasakawa Peace Foundation through the National Association of Japan-America Societies. Thank you for the faith and trust you put in Japan's side of New Orleans to host this event. While we're disappointed in not being able to host an in-person event due to COVID-19 restrictions, our online presentation has enabled the participation of our international audience, including significant participation from Japan. For our Japanese audience, konbanwa, honjitsu wa minasan sanka itarikimashite arigatou gozaimasu. I would like to send a special thank you out to our board of directors for their support for this event. I'm very pleased to see a number of registrations from Southeastern Louisiana University. So a special thank you to Dr. Samantha Perez, Professor of History, and one of our Japan Society of New Orleans board members. While Japan Society of New Orleans recently hosted its third Japan-U.S. military program, this is our first Geostrategy in the Grassroots event. I don't want to spoil any introductions by tonight's moderator. However, I'm proud to say one of our panelists tonight is homegrown and a fellow graduate of Tulane University in New Orleans. 1 week from today will be the 10th anniversary of the Great Eastern Earthquake and Tsunami. While this event was tragic in its loss of life and property, it demonstrated the deep ties of friendship and cooperation between our two countries. New Orleans especially saw this after its own tragedy, Hurricane Katrina in 2005, where Japanese aid significantly contributed to our recovery. We in New Orleans stand with our Japanese friends in remembrance of this significant event in your history. I have the honor and privilege to introduce our moderator tonight, Mr. Peter Kelly, President of the National Association of Japan-America Societies. I've known Peter for over 10 years, and it was over dinner with him in 2011 that led to the revitalization of Japan Society of New Orleans after our Hurricane Katrina experience. Through his guidance and mentoring, Japan Society of New Orleans has strengthened its relationship with its sister city, Matsue City, Shimane, with multiple visits and exchanges. Japan Society of New Orleans participated in the Tomodachi Exchange Program, and through our own fundraising efforts, sent an exchange of young professionals to Matsue in 2019. I'd like to publicly recognize Peter for his outstanding leadership. Japan Society of New Orleans is very grateful to have you as a friend and mentor. So without further ado, over to you, Peter.
Thank you, Mike. It's a pleasure to join you this evening. It's only the only thing we regret is not being able to be in New Orleans with you this evening. It's always such a pleasure to go to New Orleans, and we miss it. But we'll make the best of the situation with a virtual meeting for the first time in the Geostrategy series. Tonight's event is part of the Geostrategy in the Grassroots series, which is a partnership between the National Association of Japan-America Societies in Washington, D.C., and the Sasakawa Peace Foundation in Tokyo. We began this series a couple of years ago with the aim of providing an update on the geostrategic challenges that Americans and Japanese face in Asia. And we did that because we feel that in many places, in many states in the United States, and Louisiana is one, which have a significant economic interest with Japan. There's a good recognition of Japan as an economic investor, and the importance of the economic relationship is well understood. But the geostrategic situation in Asia is changing, and it's important that as Americans and Japanese, we understand both countries' viewpoints and both countries' perspectives on how the geostrategic situation in Asia is changing. For that reason, we began this program with the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. The highlight of the program is a speaker from Japan and a speaker from the United States, both experts in the field of geostrategic challenges, who represent perspectives from each country. Tonight's event is the fifth of 9 geostrategy events that we're hosting this year between February and March. Each has a different speaker from Japan and from the United States, and each is organized and hosted by the local Japan-America Society. The Japan Society of New Orleans is one of NAJAS's oldest members and a very active membership. We are always so pleased to work with Mike and with Honorary Consul Donna Fresh and all of you in New Orleans on events related to Japan and New Orleans. This is the first Geostrategy in the Grassroots series, and we're delighted to inaugurate this program in New Orleans. The way we'll handle this is talks of around 15 minutes each by our two experts. We'll lead off with Tomohiko Satake, who is a senior fellow of defense in the Defense Policy Division in the Policy Studies Department of the National Institute for Defense Studies in Tokyo, Japan. Professor Satake will describe what the National Institute of Defense Studies is during his presentation. He's a graduate of Keio University with a PhD from Australian National University. And his focus is really on alliance studies and Asia-Pacific regional issues and security. So he's just the right person to talk to us about a Japanese perspective on the challenges in Asia. Professor Satake?
Well, I'm sorry for my mistake. Well, thank you very much for your kind introduction, Peter. And first of all, I'd like to thank the Japan Society in New Orleans, as well as the Sasakawa Peace Foundation for hosting this wonderful event. So today I'm going to talk about some security challenges Japan and the United States are facing. So Candice, could you just share my slide, please? Well, thank you very much. Well, just to introduce myself, NIDS, National Institute for Defense Studies, is a think tank for Ministry of Defense of Japan. And we do some policy-oriented research on security issues, as well as the study of war history. We also have some educational course for senior SDF officials, as well as some civilian officials on the MOD. So we are pretty much like a defense college in the other countries. And then also I'm a sort of public servant for the Ministry of Defense. But nevertheless, what I'm going to discuss today is just my personal views and doesn't reflect the official viewpoint of the government. So could you go to next slide, please? Right, so let me start from the some security challenges Japan has been facing right now. I think one of the most important issue, and perhaps the famous one, is the so-called gray zone challenges, by Chinese paramilitary, in the region surrounding Senkaku Islands. And as you can see from this Japanese Coast Guard, China has apparently stepped up their activities in the region surrounding Japanese Senkaku Island. And last year, for example, Chinese Coast Guard ship appeared almost 333 times, in the region, in the contiguous zone surrounding Senkaku Island. That was the largest ever number, of course, ever. And China actually introduced a new Coast Guard law in November last year, and then that law came into effect last February. And that law actually authorized the use of force by Chinese Coast Guard ships under the jurisdiction claimed by China. So which means that, Chinese Coast Guard ships can use their weapons almost everywhere in South China Sea and some parts in the East China Sea as well. So that can be a kind of great concern for Japanese government right now. Next slide, please. So of course, Japan has stepped up their activities in this region as well. But nonetheless, there are some legal issues under these gray zone situations. In principle, so Japan cannot use a force, which means mobilize SDF, unless an armed attack occurs. Armed attack, except for some special cases such as maritime policing activities. And then the question is, what is this armed attack actually? And the Japanese Prime Minister has responded like this. These are cases in which extremely serious damage on power without caused by attacks by physical measures arises. And the attacks are made by other party in a systematic and premeditated manner. Systematic and premeditated manner. But that actually causes some ambiguities or at least potential, perception gaps between Japanese and the U.S. policymakers. For example, does the actions of another country constitute an armed attack or not? So let's say, for example, if Chinese Coast Guard ship collides with a Japanese Coast Guard ship or even SDF vessel in the water surrounding Senkaku Islands, and can Japan recognize it's an armed attack or not? Maybe not, because it's not like a systematic or premeditated manner. But the U.S. may understand this is armed attack because it's obviously a hostile attack by Chinese or whatever in paramilitary or military. So I think there's a kind of perception gaps that could happen between Japanese and U.S. officials, and that leads to the second point. When should the Article 5 of the Security Treaty be invoked? And that's a really important issue as well, because whenever these kind of gray zone situations in U.S. involvement is crucial. But nevertheless, the Article 5 of the Security Treaty cannot be invoked without Japanese recognition of the armed attack. So I think it's very important for both policymakers to share some views on these, legal issues under the gray zone situations. So that's the one thing. Second slide, please. Next slide, please. Next is maybe North Korea, and as you can see from this slide by MOD, I think the Kim Jong-un government, stepped up their nuclear and missile developments, since the inauguration in 2020. We tend to forget about this, but actually North Korea still, is an important threat for Japanese security. And also some technologies or operational capabilities of North Korea's missiles has been advanced quite rapidly. For example, they've already succeeded in the SLBM, submarine launched ballistic missile test, or miniaturization of the nuclear warhead has been perhaps successful. And also, of course, they have developed some ICBM that can reach to the U.S. homeland. So these are kind of important issues, at least for Japan, U.S. policymakers. And so far, North Korea has been refraining from any missile test, I think, since March last year. But I think as it gets to, that the Biden administration will not take so much kind of soft approach to North Korea, unlike Trump administration. I think it's more likely that North Korea will turn to some provocative, actions again. So I think that's the things Japanese and policymakers and U.S. policymakers have to prepare for, right now. Next slide, please. And finally, let me briefly touch upon the so-called strike gap between the U.S. and China. And this is a CSI slide, and as you can see, China has so many intermediate range ballistic missiles, and they have a ground-based IRBM, which the U.S. doesn't have because of the INF treaty with Russia. And some people say that that actually created some strike gaps between the U.S. and China, and that affects some extended deterrence capabilities of the U.S. military. So in order to fill the gap, the U.S. has considered deployment of the ground-based IRBM in allies, on the allies, including Japan. But I wonder if the Japanese people accept such a deployment because of their kind of strong anti-militaristic sentiment. And the Japanese government recently canceled the installation of their Aegis ashore, partly because of the local oppositions, and also this debate over the so-called counter-striking capabilities against enemy's bases. Tekikichi Kogekiron has been suspended right now, partly because of domestic opposition and partly because opposition from the inner circle of the government. So simply put, Japan's anti-military sentiment remains very strong. So next slide, please. Now, the good news for Japan is that Japan has taken so many security reforms since the second administration. Then that actually includes the defense capability build-ups or some institutional reforms of security policies. And Japan also adopted a new security legislation which allowed the use of rights of the collective self-defense for the first time in history. And at the same time, Japan and the US renewed the so-called Defense Cooperation Guidelines in 2015. And that included the Alliance Coordination Mechanism, which is a kind of a policy coordination mechanism between the US and Japanese officials, not only for some special occasion, but also for some wide range of issues, including the gray zone activities. And for example, this ACM was utilized after the 2016 North Korea's nuclear test. So I think this kind of policy coordination has been developing right now between US and Japan. And Japan also adopted the new National Defense Program guidelines. And that actually adopts the concept of multi-domain defense force. So since then, Japan has invested a lot for some new domains such as cyberspace and electromagnetic. For example, last year, the Japan established the first space security squadron or something like that, space security unit inside the SDF, Air Self-Defense Forces. So these are kind of new things which has been undergoing right now. Next slide, please. Also, Japan has actually actively engaged with the some defense diplomacy in the Pacific region. And here's just one example, but since 2017, Japanese MSDF has engaged with some long-term deployment missions called the Indo-Pacific Deployment. And this is the example, IPD in 2019. And as you can see from this slide, after leaving Japanese port, Japanese vessels such as Izumo and Murasame, destroyers, goes to some countries in Southeast Asia and also Indian Ocean as well, and occasionally conduct some joint training, exercise, or capacity building activities with those regional countries. And sometimes they have some military exercise with the Australia, France, or of course the United States in this part of the region. So what's really significant is that these activities used to be taboo, for Japan. I mean, except for some special occasions such as the counter-piracy missions or multilateral exercises. But now it's getting more and more common for the Japanese SDF to operate regularly in this Indo-Pacific region under the concept of the free and open in the Pacific. So I think that's a really new development right now. Next slide, please. Okay, Japan has also expanded strategic partnership with some non-US countries, non-US partners. And as you can see from this slide, Australia is obviously the most important partner for Japan, except for the United States. We have a joint security declaration, 2+2, AXA is some logistics agreement, and also have an information security agreement. Military exercise has been conducted in ground, air, and maritime domain as well. And we have also agreed upon some arms sales and defense technology cooperation and so on. And also Japan has expanded its partnership with other European countries such as UK and France, and India obviously is increasingly important partner for Japan. Last year we have concluded some AXA with India, which was really significant, I think. And not only this bilateral cooperation, but also some trilateral and quadrilateral security cooperation, such as Japan, Australia, India, and the United States has been developing. So I think Japan can probably take advantage of this kind of strategic assets in order to complement the US-led hub and spokes alliance structure. Next slide, please. Okay, finally, let me briefly touch upon some generational changes in Japanese policy discourse. I'm teaching at the university, but I feel that young generation has much more kind of a realistic and sober views on Japanese defense and security policies. And here's just example. I'm sorry, only Japanese data is available, but this shows some opinions regarding how to protect Japanese security. And actually, this shows that young generations, such as between maybe 18 and 39 years old, tend to support, or majority of young generation support the US-Japan alliance and the SDF as well, other means to protect Japanese security. And this is also supported by some older generation, elderly people. But at the same time, there are a certain number of people who support armed neutrality, Hibuso Churitsu, in this generation as well. But that's no longer the case for, the Japanese young generation. And the right picture shows people support for national referendum for constitutional amendment proposed by the former Abe government in 2019. And again, as you can see, young generation tend to support the national referendum for constitutional amendment, compared to some older generations. And which doesn't necessarily mean, of course, that the young generation support the constitutional amendment itself. But nevertheless, they are quite open for the debate or discussion, which used to be actually taboo in the previous years. And the good news is that that doesn't necessarily mean that these young generation are getting more and more conservative or tilting toward the right or something like that. Instead, they are more receptive to some liberal agendas such as same-sex marriage or accepting immigrations or something like that. I think what's really important is that these generations tend to see the things beyond previous paradigm of ideological paradigm between the progressive and conservative, Hoshu and Kakushin and so on, and getting more and more kind of pragmatic views. So I think bringing this kind of young voices into a Japanese strategic debate will perhaps change the Japanese security policy a bit more in a forward-looking posture, which also strengthen the US-Japan alliance. Okay, I'm sorry I was a bit over time, but I finished here and welcome your comments or some discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Satake Sensei. That was a comprehensive view of situation in Japan. Satake Sensei points out a couple of areas of real concern: Chinese activities in what he refers to as the gray zone, North Korean missiles, and Chinese missiles. On the one hand, on the other hand, he points to some areas of changed perspectives in Japan. He mentions the policy coordination mechanisms with the United States, diplomatic efforts and deployment of Japanese troops in the South China Sea and related areas, and also the partnerships that Japan is working on, both bilateral and quadrilateral, that are defense related, and the changing perspective of young people in Japan in relation to defense. So an interesting set of perspectives from Japan about both the challenges and also how things are changing in Japan in terms of the perception of those challenges. Let's now shift to our other speaker, who, as Mike Turner told you, is a homegrown product of Louisiana and Tulane, Richard Fontaine. Richard is the CEO of the Center for New American Security, which is a think tank in Washington, D.C. Satake Sensei is a think tank belonging to the Defense Department in Japan, and Richard's think tank is an independent and bipartisan think tank in Washington, D.C. He's been with the CNAS since 2009 and the CEO for the last couple of years. Prior to that, he was a foreign policy advisor for the late Senator John McCain and worked in both the State Department and also on Capitol Hill. So Richard brings a clear perspective with the Center from the Center for New American Security of how Americans need to think about defense issues and security issues in Asia. Richard, I wish we could say welcome to New Orleans in person, but we can say welcome to New Orleans virtually.
Well, it's great to be as close as I can get to New Orleans and to all of the friends there. It's great to be able to speak to the Japan Society, and so thanks to Mike Turner and to Peter and the association. Having spent the first 21 years of my life in and around New Orleans, my first ever real job outside summer jobs was when I graduated from Tulane and moved to Japan to teach English in a Japanese high school, having not only never been to Japan, but having never gone to Asia in my life. And to say that it was an eye-opening experience would be understating it, but it was a wonderful thing. Hopefully, sooner rather than later, we can all get together in New Orleans and talk these things over. I think Satake Sensei did a really great job at laying out some of the strategic priorities, particularly on the military and defense side, that face Japan and how Japan is responding to them. So what I thought I would try to do is just offer a few thoughts on kind of the big picture of well, essentially geopolitics in the Asia, in the Indo-Pacific region, and the role of the U.S.-Japan relationship in all of that. And you can't really get too far into that without talking a little bit about China and to some degree about North Korea. So, just to start with a little bit of the basics behind all this, the United States and Japan have had a very strong and close alliance, which only seemed to grow closer and more productive with each passing year. And the purpose of the Japan alliance, the purpose of any alliance, is an insurance policy, right, against threats that may or may not ever materialize. Originally, the U.S.-Japan alliance was an insurance policy that would help manage the risks associated with the Soviet Union. Times have changed, obviously. And while the alliance does many things, overall, its biggest goal is to preserve order in the broad Indo-Pacific region. Now, what does that mean? Because, it's a broad and abstract concept itself. Well, it's striking that the first sort of definition given to some of this was actually offered by Prime Minister Abe a few years ago when he started referring to the objective of free and open Indo-Pacific. This free and open Indo-Pacific language was adopted by the Trump administration and by Washington. Now, of course, in a Biden administration, they sometimes change the adjectives around and talk about, a free and open Indo-Pacific that's also prosperous and secure or whatever. But whatever words you use to describe this, it stems in part from Prime Minister Abe and Tokyo's vision of regional order, the challenge of that order and the objectives of the U.S.-Japan relationship, and then also some of these other partnerships that Satake Sensei mentioned that are starting to grow up around the region. And so then, okay, so you've got this insurance policy, you've got this regional order you want to sort of protect. We think that it's good because it allows countries to be free and democratic and prosperous. So what are the risks of this thing? Well, the two that I think were embedded both in Satake Sensei's presentation and what I would say is China and North Korea being the obvious choices, obvious focus, and U.S.-Japan relations are focused on dealing with both of those. On China, there's been a pretty dramatic shift in U.S. policy over the past few years. I mean, back when I was working in the George W. Bush administration on the National Security Council staff at the White House, there was a policy toward China that was an engagement policy. It was engage but hedge, but it was based on the idea that through deep economic engagement and diplomatic engagement, even military engagement with China, that China would become a more responsible actor on the international stage. It would become more invested in the existing rules. It might become more liberal over time, and maybe even over a longer period of time become more democratic. And that was really continued through most of the Obama administration. But the problem with it is that there's no evidence that those things were happening, that the engagement was not really transforming China in the ways that it was predicated on. And so there's very few people now that hold out much hope that anytime soon China will become more liberal or more democratic. Certainly it's gone the opposite direction, or that it'll become, in our eyes, kind of a more responsible international actor. And so what this means is, the Trump administration came in with a pretty new approach to China, which was one premised on long-term competition between the United States and China. And I think that's where the Biden administration comes in as well. The difference here is between the two sides is the administrations, both of them have been keen to make sure that the measure of this competition is not the United States on one side and China on the other. It's the United States and its allies and its partners on one side and China on the other. And of course, they won't give up on the opportunities to be able to cooperate with China on some areas of mutual interest. But I think there is this sort of competitive mindset that is animating things when you're not talking about things like climate change or pandemic, but rather political influence, economic influence, military access, and so forth. And that's, of course, where the U.S. Congress is as well. So you have a new administration, a U.S. Congress focused on competition with China and focused on partners with and allies as sort of a key differentiating advantage for the United States. And this is where the U.S.-Japan alliance is extraordinarily important. One of the things that sometimes we forget, in part because of the constitutional and legal restrictions on the use of the Japanese military, is just how capable it is. So, we always think of the British Navy. Well, the Japanese Navy, don't call it that, but the Japanese Navy is bigger than the British Navy. Outside China, Japan has the most powerful military in Asia, and continues to take steps to deepen both its experience, its connections with the United States and with other countries in the region, and its sort of professionalism and expertise. And so we have this sort of alliance with this, powerful Northeast Asian ally in Japan. But then things start to get tricky because, no one wants to go to war. And this is sort of premised on the idea that by being prepared to defeat any adversary, that would be the best way of deterring a war in the first place. So, okay, well, what are we trying to deter? And that's when you get into some of the gray zone type activities that Satake sensei mentioned, because China is not going around invading other countries, requiring anyone to fend them off. They're taking steps like militarizing the South China Sea or using this kind of gray zone activity to harass Taiwan or Japan around the Senkaku Islands and things like that. And of course, they're also doing things well outside the military sphere in the economic competition and technology, especially. So the US and Japan are sort of teaming up, not only on the military side, but also in the technology side, offering alternatives to Chinese 5G, for example, infrastructure projects, diversifying investment and supply chains that are otherwise dependent on China and so forth. There's still a lot of work to do across the waterfront of those activities, including the military side, but especially on the economic and the technology sides. But as Satake Sensei mentioned, with these coordination mechanisms and some of the other things that have been put into place over the past few years, I think there's a meeting of the minds on a lot of these things. Even as with any two countries, there are going to be differences in the approaches, not only with respect to China, but to Russia and Myanmar and other countries. The other things that I'll just kind of mention beyond, preparing for and this hopefully deterring any potential conflict with China is a raft of other things that the US and Japan are starting to do and can do to sort of bolster this regional order. One is on the intelligence side. We have this mechanism, the Five Eyes, which is 5 countries, all English speaking. It's Canada, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States, that are very close collaborators on intelligence sharing. Japanese officials have suggested they'd like to be the 6th eye to that. And I think there's a lot of merit in trying to do that. There's already some hesitations on the US side over some of the difficulties, security clearances in Japan and all these other things. But harmonizing and bringing closer that intelligence cooperation would be kind of a key thing. On the economic side, there are 2 regional economic agreements in Asia. One is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which strangely the United States was one of the authors of, and then had to try to convince the Japanese to come into. And then the United States bailed on it, and Prime Minister Abe took it and brought it across the finish line. So now it's in effect. The United States is outside of it. So the United States is able to exercise neither very significant economic leadership in Asia, and its businesses face higher tariffs and barriers to trade for the countries that are inside it. It looks like the politics of trade in the United States right now aren't going to let us go back into that thing, which is unfortunate. But it's the U.S. and Japan are going to need to sort of see what the alternatives to that are. Is there coordination in some of the bodies that set standards, or on investment restrictions, or on digital economy agreements and things like that? I'll end with 2 points. One is on North Korea. The North Koreans have been relatively quiet for the past year or so after the dramatic summit diplomacy with President Trump and Kim Jong-un and all of this. I think the quietness is about to go away, and the North Koreans will make their displeasure with American sanctions known by resuming testing of missiles and possibly even nuclear testing again. The United States came close to war during the Trump administration before the diplomacy took over, which I think is not only extremely risky on its own merits, but also a huge distraction from the bigger challenge in Asia, which is on China. Here, Japan, given its geography, its history, and everything else, is sort of, right in the middle of the threat that comes out of North Korea back when they were firing off missiles before some of these were coming very disconcertingly close to islands in Japan. And so working with Japan, in my view, to manage but not try to solve the problem of North Korea, to deter them and make sure they sort of stay contained is the key there. And then finally, we've seen over the past few years with some rather uneven American international leadership, and particularly regional leadership, with the withdrawal from TPP and some of these other things, that Prime Minister Abe really stepped up and started to lead on trade, on some of the regional diplomacy, on alliance issues, on things like that. Under Prime Minister Suga, we'll see whether that kind of regional leadership continues at the same sort of vigorous level that it was under Prime Minister Abe, and whether there's this kind of void that endures that was starting to open up under the previous administration. In a perfect world, we'd see a really energetic and active and leading Japan, and a really energetic and active and leading United States, so that it's additive and they're working together in harmony to try to bolster this regional order for the benefit of both of our countries. And I think that's possible. Whether it'll happen, we're just going to have to see. But thanks, and I look forward to the discussion.
Great, thanks, Richard. It's important to put the U.S.-Japan alliance in context, as you did, with focusing on the preservation of order in Asia and the deterrence of conflict. It would appear that China understands that too, and therefore the gray zone activity seems carefully calibrated to test both of those ideas. Let's have let me ask a couple of questions as the moderator, and then we will open up the opportunity for members of the audience to ask. You may ask questions by putting them in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. First question that I have for both Richard and Satake Sensei is, there's a lot of talk about Chinese pressure on Taiwan. And that's something that if you look at what could require responses or cause strains in the U.S.-Japan approach, that might be one of them. What do you think the likelihood of that is, and what do you think the response of the two countries would be to Chinese pressure on Taiwan? Why don't we start with Satake Sensei and then go to Richard?
Yeah, thank you very much for your very important question, Peter. I think the Taiwan issue is really, strong concern among Japanese policymakers as well. And well, obviously, over the past 2 years, the balance of power between China and Taiwan has been shifting, I think, in favor of China. And I think this year the the Trump administration announced revealed some document for the Indo-Pacific strategy, and that actually document also said that the U.S. has committed to the defense of Taiwan, which shows that U.S. has been also strongly concerned with the development of this region. So that said, I think it's really important to prepare for some potential crisis or contingency over Taiwan, straits, and as I said, policy coordination, for example, between Japanese and US officials is really crucial. But at the same time, we have to have some brainstorming or some policy simulations between those policy makers in order to prepare for some actual situation happening. And obviously, Japan is going to provide some logistic support for the U.S. military station in Japan, or let the U.S. military use the Japanese port or bases or something like that. I don't know what kind of support we can provide, but those are kind of brainstorming or policy simulations, and maybe joint policy planning is really important for speakers.
Richard?
Yeah, so it's tricky for a couple reasons. One is Taiwan, America's defense commitment to Taiwan has always had a degree of ambiguity. It is unlike the treaty, the collective, the mutual defense agreement with Japan or the Philippines or South Korea. So a president would not be bound by treaty to defend Taiwan in case of an attack by China, and would have to make a decision. But that said, all of the kind of body language over the years has suggested pretty strongly that American presidents think that defending Taiwan in the face of attack would be a major priority. But of course, you ask yourself, what does that really mean? And it could mean everything up to full-scale war with China, which is in everyone's interest to avoid, obviously, as possible. I see kind of two kind of tricky aspects to this beyond maybe the obvious. One is Japan's role. So Japan's role, even after the passage of the legislation that allows for collective self-defense rather than just defense of the home islands, does that allow Japan to actively defend Taiwan? Maybe Satake Sensei knows the answer to that. I don't think anybody knows the answer to that. I think that would be a decision made in the moment. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that the answer is no. Japan is not going to, risk going to war with China. Well, where would the American vessels, sailors, troops, missiles, everything come from? A lot of that's going to come from Japan. If, God forbid, we were in a war with China, it's not going to let Americans steam across and wait to do anything until they showed up next to the Chinese mainland. They're going to go after bases and ports and vessels in Japan. So Japan's in this one way or the other if something like this happens, and that it's not clear to me that we've thought through those scenarios very carefully at all. The other tricky thing is, if you're China and you're looking to try to undermine the claim that defend Taiwan or something, you don't have to do what people often think of as, an armada sails across the Taiwan Strait 90 miles and then they land on the beaches and, this other stuff. There are Taiwanese islands that are 2 miles off the Chinese mainland, Penghu and things like that, where you can literally see the mainland. So, instead of going after an island of 20 million, let's say the Chinese had a pretext and they went after one of those little islands really close to the Chinese mainland. Is that worth going to war against China for? If the answer is yes, it's pretty risky. If the answer is no, then our security commitments start to crumble a little bit. So it's tricky.
Tricky it is. Sounds like do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think, 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 yeah, I think So Japan's collective self-defense can be only exercised when Japanese security, survival, and liberty and happiness are significantly jeopardized. So as Richard mentioned, it's we have a very high hurdle to exercise the collective self-defense. But we have also a concept of the so-called important influence situation, 重要影響事態. That situation will have so that allows the SDF to provide some logistic support to the U.S. military in a situation that will have a significant influence on Japanese security. So I'm not sure if this situation concept can be applied for the Taiwan issues or not. I think the government maintains some ambiguities, but I think these are kind of expected scenario.
So it seems like ambiguity is the word of the minute, but events, as Richard says, events may force decisions that one hopes that the two nations are consulting on even now. Second question for me is the Satake Sensei. You mentioned Japan's not only deployment of troops but also Japan's security work in security arrangements in Asia, both bilateral and quadrilateral. One of the things we hear about is the Quad. Your sense of where is the Quad? What direction is it going? How much of a role can it play in the deterrence function that Richard mentioned?
Yes. So yeah, I think the so-called Quad is really popular, in these days among the some strategic debate. But it's really funny because nobody has defined what Quad is. The Japanese government has never used the term Quad. Instead, they are actually saying that policy coordination between U.S. and Japan, India, Australian officials or something like that. And Quad is obviously not like Asian NATO, as some people say. It's not like institutionalized, and it doesn't have any collective defense obligation and so on. It's more like a loose policy coordination mechanism between those four countries. Of course, it doesn't necessarily mean that Quad is unimportant. I think it's really important to coordinate their policies in many areas, not only in maritime security but also in HADR, cyber securities, or some digital economy and supply chain management and so on. So these are kind of important measures to step up their activities and how to push back against the Chinese power and influence in the region. So Quad is going to be really important, but it's not like a collective defense mechanism as somebody mentions. And also we have some trilateral or minilateral mechanism between the US, Japan, Australia, Japan, India, Australia, and sometimes Japan, UK, France, or something like that. So these are really important assets, as I said, like in order to cope with some regional security challenges.
Richard?
Yeah, I won't repeat what Satake Sensei said on the Quad, because I really agree that but the last point is important too, because what you're seeing across the region over the past only about 7 or 8 years is really an explosion of loose, informal, generally informal kinds of partnerships that will have 3 countries here, 4 countries there, 2 countries here, 5 countries there. Japan is a perfect example of one that's involved in all of the. Satake Sensei had a slide on this. And that was sort of what Japan is doing bilaterally with those countries. But Japan's part of the Quad. It's part of a special relationship with Australia bilaterally. It's part of the US, Australia, Japan kind of relationship. So what you're seeing is all these overlapping arrangements, none of which is a treaty where an attack on one is attack on the other. But it's evidence of, what the international relations scholars would show as balancing power. As they see that one power rise, the other ones start to get together and consolidate things, not in a formal way, but in a way that is closer, more active, and more formal than it was a few years ago.
That's a And as Satake said, in many ways, that represents progress in the sense of Japan thinking strategically about the role of its own role in security arrangements in Asia. Before we get to the audience questions, let me ask one more, which has kind of a local an aspect in Louisiana. Japan is, of course, a very energy-dependent country, and one of the recent developments has been the advent of shipments of natural gas from the United States, and including Louisiana and Cameron, to Japan. What is the importance in the security arrangements what's the importance of energy, and how does the development of natural gas shipments from the United States affect that?
Satake Sensei, you want to go?
Me? Okay. Oh, yeah. I think energy security has been, one of the most important issues in the U.S.-Japan alliance, although it has been sometimes dismissed. And so I think you are hitting the right point. And Japan has imported shale energy from the U.S. I think since 2017, and I think this is really important for Japan as it get more and more diversifying its energy resources by reducing its dependence on nuclear energy. I think since March 11th, Tohoku earthquake in 2011. So LNG is really crucial, and also it's relatively clean compared to other energies such as coal or oil. So Suga administration goes to carbon neutral by 2035 or something like that. So I think it's getting more and more important for Japanese energy policy. I didn't know most of it comes from Louisiana, but I hope this kind of cooperation continues, and it's also continuously important to secure a kind of stable supply of energy from Middle East to especially for Japan. And so I think the Suga and Biden administration will strengthen the U.S.-Japan alliance in wider areas, including energy security. So that's the thing we have to consider right now.
Yeah, and all I would add to that is just, again, how much things have changed just over the past few years, because energy security for decades meant keeping a lid on conflicts in the Middle East, right? So, I mean, go back to the 1991 war in Iraq, where Japan didn't participate, but it cut a check to the U.S. Treasury, billions of dollars to defray the costs associated, because Japan had a huge interest in not seeing Iraq have possession of Kuwait's oil fields and that supply. And we've gone from, yes, the Middle East has still got importance, but we've gone from making sure that the U.S. and Japan can cooperate to get oil and gas from the Middle East. And of course, Japan doesn't have really much source of its own supply of oil or gas, and so imports it all. So now it gets it from Louisiana. And if you had said a few years ago that LNG would be coming, not from the Caspian or the Middle East, but from Louisiana, I don't know how many people would have expected that. So it's been a big change.
Sure has, and like everything else, it has has both a short-term impact and a longer-term impact, given Japan's interest in a clean environment and clean environment policies. Let's shift to a couple of questions from the audience. One is from Mike Yaguchi, who always asks good questions. Is the demise of the INF treaty between the U.S. and Russia destabilizing with respect to the Asia-Pacific ballistic missile threat?
I can take a shot at that. I think it's actually the withdrawal of the United States from INF is going to end up being stabilizing in the Indo-Pacific. So for those who are not totally versed in their INF treaty provisions, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty sounds like it only constrains nuclear weapons, but it actually constrains missiles, whether they're nuclear or conventional, that are in the intermediate range, that are ground launched. So it didn't constrain air launch, it didn't constrain submarine launch, but it did constrain the ability of the United States and Russia to build intermediate range missiles. Russia was found cheating. The United States got out. We're not going to get back in. Intermediate range missiles, China has not been party to the INF treaty. It was a US-Russia thing. China has thousands of intermediate range missiles, ground launch intermediate range missiles that it uses to hold targets at risk in places like Japan. The United States has had 0 of those. Now we have a lot of other things, but one of the advantages of intermediate range missiles is they're relatively cheap compared to other, systems. You can move them around, and you can make a number of them. So if you look at what's possible now that the United States is out of the intermediate range, out of the INF, then it will be able to deploy ground-launched missiles to hold sites in China at risk, and hopefully the deterrence will hold both ways, right? So, but of course, there's a big political question: is where do you put those missiles? And Satake Sensei may be able to tell us whether those missiles would ever go to Japan or not.
Wow. As I said, it's really political sensitive.
Brilliant way to end the question, Richard, and put it over to Satake-san.
No, I have actually nothing to add to what Richard says. I really mostly agree with that. But some people propose a new INF treaty between US, Russia, and China and something like that. But I tend to be very pessimistic about that because, during the Cold War, the game was really simple. The US and Soviet actually faced with each other and under the bipolarity, and they have mostly a parity, in terms of missiles. But today, they have many divergent, I think, threat environment. Russia, for example, targets not only NATO but also its neighbors such as China and some countries, maybe in the Middle East, and also China targets not only the US and its allies, but Russia and India, are potential, I think, targets for those missiles. And as I said, the US considered the deployment of ground-based, range missile, but not only in Asia but also in Europe. So I think considering that kind of complex threat environment, it's really difficult for those countries to reach some consensus. So that's my short answer.
Yeah. And just to follow up on that, what about ballistic missile defense? That's been a topic in Japan, as you mentioned, Satake Sensei, the decision not to deploy the system that was planned. What do you think is the future of ballistic missile defense in Japan in relation to Asia?
So BMD has been really the most important, actually, method to protect the North Korea's missile attack and potentially China's missile attacks. But as I said, the Japanese government has canceled the installation of Aegis Ashore, which are supposed to reduce some burden of a sea-based, missile defense. And then the government has considered some alternative measure to this Aegis Ashore, which might be a sort of float Aegis Ashore type of thing, that putting Aegis Ashore on the ships or something like that. So, but that really actually costly more than the original plan. So I think it's really the issue right now. And the important thing is should we continue to depend on this deterrence by denial or some missile defense, which is really costly. And that's the reason why some people consider the so-called tekikichi kogeki ron, the counter-striking capability against the enemies. That also deterrence by denial, but hopefully that could kind of reduce the some costs for the previous, ballistic missile defense system. So I think this kind of paradigm shift can be taking place and potentially, reducing the cost for Japanese BMD. What do you think about Richard?
Well, I think that, as you said, the government canceled the Aegis Ashore purchase, but it did so after about 2 years of North Korea not shooting missiles in the direction of Japan. And whatever the missile defense capabilities look like, I think they're suddenly going to seem much more interesting when North Korea starts shooting missiles again. So I think watch this space.
Watch this space. Well, we will watch this space. Another question from the audience. This is from Samantha Perez, a very interesting one. Dr. Satake mentioned the significance of generational shift in attitude in Japan towards defense. What about the United States? Do you see any kind of similar observations from a U.S. perspective?
That's a great question, and the answer is yes. And there's evidence of generational differences, not just in the anecdotal sort of what I see on a regular basis, but also in some of the polling data and so forth. And I think there's two things that stand out to me. One is on attitudes towards China. There's the older generation, at least of foreign policymakers, for whom China was, not an ally, but a partner throughout the Cold War. And then, after normalization of ties with China and was, a link together against the Soviet Union. And then there were huge hopes after the end of the Cold War about engaging China and for an older generation for whom Xi Jinping and this recent sort of more provocative, more repressive approach is just one set of years in a long experience. They tend to be, I think, on balance, more interested in engagement and what's possible and what about cooperation. Let's not go back to a Cold War. The younger generation just tends to be much more hawkish on China, saying, they undermine our values, they undermine our security, et cetera, and we've got to take this very seriously, and are pretty pessimistic about areas of cooperation and so forth. So that's on China. And then the other one, not surprisingly, is on climate change. And every age cohort, as you get younger and younger, thinks that climate change is a more important issue than the age cohort above it. And so when an older generation sometimes talks about, okay, threats to America. Well, threats to America are China moving on Taiwan, and then we've got to do this, and then that undermines our security commitments, and then Japan comes in and they say, the climate's warming. You want to see a threat to the future of the United States and the world? It's climate. Like, you don't have to look very far, so we need to prioritize that in a much more aggressive way than it has been. So those are the differences that I see generationally.
Interesting thought. Satake Sensei, we have a question that's probably an equally difficult one, but it is Prime Minister Suga faces, I guess he faces two elections, if you think about it. One is within the Liberal Democratic Party, and the other one would be a national election this year. So the question is, the question was twofold. One, is he going to last as a prime minister? And the second is kind of a follow-up from your earlier point. That Prime Minister Abe was definitely a leader in thinking about strategically thinking about Japan and undertaking some initiatives in Asia. Is Prime Minister Suga the same type, or was Prime Minister Abe more of an exception?
Well, I don't know how long the Suga administration will survive. I think it depends on the domestic policy, including some response to COVID-19 or some domestic scandals has been taking place right now. But what I can say is that I think Suga's foreign policy pretty much continuities from the Abe administrations, including the free and open in Pacific, which is really good because, for policy like FOIP, some kind of sustainability is really important. And I think Suga administration has actually implemented, consistently the free and open Pacific policies. I think there are some changes, like Japan's policy to Russia, for example, has a little bit changed from Abe to Suga administration because Kante has no longer such power, and the Moha taking more power in foreign policy. I think which lead to the more traditional Japanese foreign policy. And so my humble answer is that, no matter actually who takes Japanese leadership role, I think the FOIP, Freedom of Indo-Pacific, can probably continue in the foreseeable future, given that it's endorsed by the United States, but also by Australia, India, and some ASEAN partners. And so it's really important. And I also welcome that Biden administration used the term FOIP, which I don't think the terminology itself does matter, but nevertheless, it was a great reassurance for some Japanese policymakers. So I expect that this kind of continuities will take place in the foreseeable future, no matter who take some leadership role in Japan. I'm not sure if I answered to your question, but that's my
we'll let you get away without a political prediction. But I think it is interesting that you mentioned the use of the term FOIP. Oftentimes in the U.S.-Japan relationship, certain words become key. And under the Obama administration, it was, what does pivot mean? And then there was the question of linchpin. What's the definition of linchpin? And this at this point, FOIP is maybe taking on those characteristics of pivot and linchpin. But we'll follow that debate as it goes along. For all those who have attended, this has been an interesting discussion. These discussions really, the key to these discussions is our speakers. And we're very grateful to Richard and to Satake Sensei for joining us, and to the Japan Society, Mike Turner and the Society in New Orleans for hosting this program. I think Mike has a final few words to sum it up and to thank our guests. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
You've just watched this program on our YouTube channel. Please subscribe for additional events, or if you wish to view this program at a later date. Also, feel free to pass on our YouTube channel information to anyone you think might be interested in this program. I'd like to thank our grantors again, Sasakawa Peace Foundation and the National Association of Japan America Societies, for their generous support. Thanks to our moderator and panelists, Mr. Peter Kelly, Dr. Tomohiko Satake, and Mr. Richard Fontaine, for a great discussion tonight. Last but not least, I'd like to thank our producer, Candace Huber of Tubby & Coos Mid-City Bookstore, one of Japan Society of New Orleans corporate sponsors, who's also been a key factor in helping us produce these events. Finally, I'd like to pitch our new podcast program from Japan Society of New Orleans called Crew of Japan. We call it a deep dive into Japanese culture. New episodes are released every Friday and run 45 minutes or so. You can subscribe to the Crew of Japan on your favorite podcast platform and keep up to date with it on Twitter. More information can be found on our website on all of this, japansocietyofneworleans.org. Little housekeeping note, if I could ask all panelists to stay online after this. Many thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. We hope you enjoyed this presentation. Good evening and oyasumi nasai.